My creepy stalker. This all occurred when I was 19 years old. I was living in a large Canadian city, and I had just graduated high school the year prior. I was struggling to find a job while deciding what I wanted to study in college. The neighborhood I lived in was crowded. In just a 5-minute walk up the street, you would reach a busy road with lots of little cafes, markets, parks. Pretty much everything you needed was nearby, and everybody knew everybody. My father spent his retirement days taking a walk up the street to meet his buddies at a bar. One of his close friends worked as a janitor at the pharmacy just across the street, and due to his troubling back pains, he offered me a job to assist him in cleaning the building after hours, and he would pay me in cash every week. It was short hours, easy cash, and very close by. Best of all, I would have an empty building to work in and didn't need to interact with people. Since the pharmacy building was just across the street from the bar my father frequented, I would stop to chat with him before going to work. One of my father's friends, Frank, was having a beer with my father one afternoon. Frank was around 60 and was always friendly to me. I didn't mind interacting with him. However, things have shifted, and I started feeling afraid of Frank. One evening, as I'm working in the pharmacy clearing out the trash and mopping the floors, I glanced out the front doors, which, thankfully, are locked by this hour. I noticed Frank pacing back and forth right in front of the building. I thought nothing of it and continued cleaning up. An hour later, I passed by the front doors again and noticed Frank is still standing outside. At this time, it's nearly 10 p.m. and dark outside. I unlocked the door and asked if he was okay. He responded by saying he wanted to know what time I got off work. Being young and naive, I thought that was okay to ask since my father and I knew him, so I told him I finished whenever I'm done cleaning up. Luckily, by the time I was finished and ready to head home, the street was completely dead silent and deserted. The very next night, I headed out to work at 5 p.m. and began cleaning up. The building is divided into 2 separate buildings, the main one and the office next door. This means sometimes I need to exit the main building and walk outside to get to the other building. This night, I had my cleaning supplies with me and headed to the next door building. As I step outside, there was Frank standing around again, facing the building as if he's waiting for me. I felt uncomfortable and a little bit afraid. He tried talking to me, but I can't remember what he was trying to say, as I was too focused on hurrying over to the next building. I got inside and locked the door behind me, leaving Frank out there. It was a small building, so I was done within 30 minutes. As I made my way to the door to head out, Frank was still standing there. I didn't want to leave until he was gone. At some point, my boss calls me on my cell phone to ask why I'm taking so long. I had to explain to him that Frank, who he is also friends with, was standing outside waiting for me. A minute later, I heard my boss come outside and yelled at Frank to leave me alone while I'm working. I finished my work for the night and peeked out the doors to see if the coast was clear before heading home. I was relieved to see that not a single person was out there. Then again, it was after 10 p.m. I walked up the street and waited for the crosswalk to turn green. As I'm waiting, I hear someone behind me. I turn to see who it is, and sure enough, it's Frank. I wanted to cry of frustration and fear. He approached me and began a normal conversation, acting as if he wasn't being creepy in the slightest. He was telling me that he wants to take me to the movies that night. I laughed and told him that it was late. He said it's okay. There are movies that late at night anyway, and insisted I went home to change, meet him back at the corner, and he would take me to the movies while he waits there for me to come back. He asked for my phone number, and being too scared and stupid, I began giving him my digits. Luckily, I snapped out of it and changed the last 2 numbers. I pretended to go home to change. I really hope you waited there all night. A few days later, I went up the street to visit my dad at the bar before my next shift. The store connected to the bar had a shoe sale going on and had set up a table full of shoes outside to attract more customers. I walked past, not interested anyway, but there was Frank just outside the bar. He stopped me and guided me to the table full of discounted shoes and said he wanted to buy me a pair, whichever I liked. By this point, I was fed up and I ignored him and entered the bar. I approached my dad and he noticed Frank talking to me outside and asked what we talked about. I was too embarrassed and afraid to tell him the truth, so I just said, "Oh, nothing really." Right after I answered that, Frank was standing at the doorway of the bar talking to some guys and my blood started to boil. I ended up telling my father the truth instead. I told him, actually, he offered to buy me a pair of shoes. My father stood up tall in his chair and gave me a look of, "What did you just say?" I then told him everything. Frank has been waiting for me outside of work too, and tried taking me to the movies late at night after one of my shifts. My father didn't waste another second. He walked up to Frank and right away punched him in the neck in front of a crowd of people. My dad yelled at him to never speak to me again. Frank was shocked and said he was sorry, over and over. I thought that was the end. I hadn't seen Frank anywhere for a few weeks after that. Until suddenly, my father started going to a different bar, just 10 steps away from the first one. It was a much darker, quieter, and just really depressing looking bar. The further you go in, the darker it gets. My father and I sat at a little table and started chatting. From the top of his shoulder, I noticed a man sitting in the far end of the bar in almost complete darkness. I knew it was Frank, but I didn't panic or mention it to my father because I knew Frank was staying away after being throat punched in public. Eventually, we moved to sit at the bar instead of the table. Frank then sat a little bit closer to us while still keeping distance. After starting to feel uncomfortable from Frank's stares, I asked my father if we could move closer to the bar entrance, and so we did. He looked really angry and vengeful, unlike the Frank I knew beforehand. After a while, we decided to head home. It's a 5-minute walk for me, but my father being elderly with physical issues, he needs to take a few breaks here and there to rest his back and catch his breath. While we were walking, he needed to take his first break, so he sat down on the edge of someone's concrete fence. As I waited for him to rest, I noticed in quite some distance behind us, Frank is heading our way, but he stopped, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, just staring in our direction. He was far enough away that I wasn't too worried. My father got up, and we continued walking, with him having no idea who was behind us. A minute later, he needed to rest again. I turned around to check, and, of course, Frank is still there. He seemed to stop walking every time we did. This happened a few times, and I was getting more and more freaked out. Frank didn't know where I lived, and even though I lived so close to work, where he was stalking me, he never really followed me home. We got really close to the house now, and Frank was catching up behind us. I didn't want him to know where I lived, so I lied to my dad and said, "I really need to use the washroom. Do you mind if I go ahead?" Of course, he had no problem with that, and I hurried up home. I wanted to get inside before Frank saw which house I went into. I immediately went up to my bedroom window. This is when I realized that hurrying home makes no difference because Frank could just wait and see which house my father goes into. As I'm watching through the window, I saw that my father noticed who was behind him. Frank very, very slowly walked past every house. My father, standing a dozen feet behind him, kept waiting for him to leave. He looked through every house, trying to see if he could see me through a window. I obviously hid so he couldn't. As he continued making his way down the street, he got so frustrated that he began punching himself in the head. I can't help but wonder what his plan was if he was so angry and following us home that day for the first time with a face full of rage. That was the last time I ever saw him before I learned years later that he got severely mentally ill and was put into an institution.